The Dawn of the Hive Mind by Elton Gar. There were plenty of people who told Jamie that getting the beta version of an untested computer attached to his brain was a bad idea. Most of the other people who had agreed had diseases or injuries that made the computer-to-brain interface a massive improvement to their lives. It let them talk, control their own TV and computer, and in some cases even move their arms and legs, though they couldn't quite get enough control to walk yet. It also made them bad spokespersons. And that was one of the major reasons that Jamie was willing to take the risk, especially since Elliot Marks had stopped doing any interviews about the technology after a terrible interview that revealed some of the shortcuts he had taken to get the implant to market quicker was leaked. Jamie still questioned his sanity as one of the nurses shaved his head. The official word was still that this wasn't surgery, but no one involved in doing the procedure was under the impression that it wasn't surgery or even that it was simple. And as he heard words like brain damage and borehole, he almost turned back. Except that he had already told almost everyone he knew and had several interviews lined up. So he reminded himself that this was his way out. It was how he'd stop being an irrelevant drone who did a job he hated. He was awake for the procedure, but given a sedative afterwards to give his brain a chance to recover. He didn't understand that until he woke up to a migraine, but there was also a flood of information. It was like having a second brain. At least that was how it was described in all the advertising, but Jamie thought it was more like having 100 people talking to you all at the same time. He was unable to focus enough to control the device, so he laid there and listened. It wasn't exactly what he had expected. There was an AI assistant, of course. It was the only one of the voices that was directed towards him. The others were stranger. It was like people having a loud conversation next to him he couldn't not overhear, but it was in his head. Some of them seemed to notice him, but they recognized that he was exhausted, so left him to rest. Once he had a couple of sips of water and was awake enough to be taken to his room where he could recover from what he was assured wasn't surgery, but certainly felt like it. Several of the voices laughed at that thought. That made Jamie feel good. He had always tried to be funny, but he overthought it, and by the time he knew what he wanted to say, the moment was over. The voices now seemed to become more focused, and several of them seemed to understand, though their inability to get the words out was more physical than Jamie's. That was when he began to understand what had happened. The computer in his brain was designed to automatically connect to other technology. That, it seemed, included the other brain implants.
"This is wrong,"
Jamie said. This time, the voices in his head became more unified, and they said,
"Don't tell anyone. This is what happened to the last group of test subjects."
Jamie understood. There were only rumors, but from what he understood, the last group of test subjects had been mentally overwhelmed and the implants removed. Though since they had been anonymous, no one could be sure what had happened to them, and rumors abounded. Jamie thought that they should tell everyone, but the voices in his head were more than just voices. They were connected directly to his brain, and while he still had the deciding vote, it was far harder to say no to them than to random people, so he decided to wait. Over the next few days, he slowly adjusted to the constant stream of information. It was more than just voices. There was a background stream of everything: emotions, pain, dreams, the book they were reading, and the TV show they were watching. He could also focus in on any single mind. It was that kept him in the hospital, an extra day. The day before he was scheduled to go home, he had focused in on the mind of someone who was watching a movie. The woman he had focused on had a stroke a few months before and was still recovering, but the implant was already helping. Not that it really helped move her limbs, though her left side was still hard to use. Instead, it let her control things like the TV and lights without having to move, as well as letting her be outside of the rehab facility. Though she technically wasn't leaving. She was simply connected to someone who was. What bothered Jamie's doctors was that the level of focus meant that he had been unresponsive when they came into the room. Not something you want out of someone who had recently had brain surgery. He tried to explain it away. But the brain surgery made that difficult as well. He could say he was daydreaming, but if there was something wrong with his brain, you couldn't trust that. Not that it mattered all that much to him. Because they were the first to get the procedure, and because it wasn't even pocket change for him, the medical costs were being paid for by Elliot Marks, the CEO of the company that created the implants. It also mattered far less where his body was when he was connected to 100 other minds. The others insisted he be more careful. Another incident of daydreaming, and he could be kept under observation for much longer, even if he was allowed to go home. That was bad because he was one of the few people with the implant who didn't have any major medical issues. So instead, he spent the day learning about the connection. He had always known it would give him access to information, but he had assumed Wikipedia. Instead, he could tap into the life experience of any of the other people. Trying to use that directly was a bit slow, though he could do it, but there was some seepage. It was like putting Jell-O on a plate with other food. As it melted, everything began to taste like Jell-O. Each of the other brains was a treasure trove of information. Some of them were mostly on how to deal with disabilities or sports trivia, but one of the implants was a veteran who had lost 3 limbs to an IED. Another had been a nurse for almost 30 years. And almost all of them had read more books than Jamie. He should have felt nervous waiting for his first interview. His hair had barely begun to grow back, and he had never been on TV before, but he wasn't alone. For the first time, almost every one of the people with the implants were focused on him. A large chunk of that focus was on making certain he didn't accidentally reveal that they were all connected. But there was also a desire to connect to more people, and this interview was the chance to do it. As Jamie walked out, he felt a strange moment as 2 of the people connected to him had the TV on. They realized that Jamie could see himself and turned it off, but he told them to turn it back on. Being able to see how he represented himself could be useful. The others agreed. And one of the minds who had been a teacher and spoke in front of people every day calmed his nerves and encouraged him to stand taller. He was still focused on all of that while the host explained who he was and why he was there. She then asked,
"How has this implant changed your life?"
He considered it and said,
There is a lot of convenience. I can connect and control almost anything electric. I could even turn your cameras off. I won't, of course.
He said as the host looked nervous. Then he continued,
It's kind of like a superpower. But it's still more important for most of the other people who have the implants. I could get up and turn a light on myself. Many of them couldn't.
So that's the biggest change?
Not at all. The biggest change is the information. I have access to virtually all knowledge ever. And I had assumed it was going to be like having a permanent connection to Wikipedia. And I do have that, but it's deeper than that. I download a book into my mind in a few seconds. I'm sure it loses some of the enjoyment of novels, but I never read those before. But the encyclopedia has been useful. And I read several books on public speaking before coming here.
And that helps?
the host asked.
I didn't throw up before I came out, so that's something. But I think it's more than just reading it, because I don't really forget it the same way.
That seems like it could be overwhelming.
The host said. Now that he was in the interview, things were easy, and Jamie let one of the others take over most of the work. They couldn't technically speak through him, but so long as he trusted them, he could just repeat the words. It went well enough that a whole new group of people were picked to get the implant. It was still being rolled out slowly, but that was good. The plan was simple enough. They would focus their attention on each person as the implant came online, and use their growing understanding of how the implants worked to convince them to not tell anyone about the connection. It worked well enough for the first half dozen. 3 of them were still getting the implant for medical reasons, but 3 others were healthy. It was the last of the 6 that caused the first major problem. He was everything that the group of them wasn't. A man who had somehow convinced himself that he had never relied on anyone and would never need to. And according to his criteria, that might even be possible, since in his mind, paying people to do things for you wasn't the same as needing them. The problem was that the idea of sharing his understanding and view of the world with a group of other people was untenable to him. He was on his way to Elliot and the company to tell them what had happened when the former soldier attacked. It wasn't physical, of course, but almost everyone had learned some tricks, and while the skills of everyone did bleed into the others, some were better than others. Greg was one of the more confrontational members of the group. The terror flooded through the entire group as Greg took control of the other man's car. Controlling electronics through someone else's implant required them not to resist. The victim might have succeeded except for the terror. But as his car began to speed up out of his control, he panicked. Almost all of the people with the implant had some understanding of how to deal with pain. But the crash was still painful. And many of them worked to dampen the pain, not only of the group, but of the man that was now dying on the pavement. Luckily, he didn't survive long. And since it was a car accident, there were no clues as to what really happened. Jamie suspected some of the people who built the device probably assumed it was a malfunction, or that he had tried to control the car with the implant. But they had every incentive not to speak up. From there, things continued smoothly. The biggest problem was slowing the rollout. As more people joined the group Mind, they could influence the others more easily, but it still took at least 20 of them to make sure new members of the Mind didn't tell anyone. That mostly involved creating the exact right amount of worry in the doctors. Too much, and they could shut down the program. Too little, and they'd speed it up. But so long as they got the symptoms just right, they would continue, but not too quickly. That became much easier when Elliot Marks, the owner of the company, got the implant. Because it was mostly a publicity stunt, no one else was scheduled for an implant that day, though that was also because all the best doctors were involved in his surgery. They expected convincing him to not speak out would be more difficult than the others. And at first, it seemed like Elliot might be a problem. He was genuinely surprised by the connection between the devices. But he collapsed under less pressure than most of the others. Jamie would have had to guess at that under other circumstances, but he had access to his mind. The man had been born rich and never had to learn to struggle like the others. And with him, everything became easier. Not only did they control the company, but they had practically unlimited resources. Those resources were pushed into creating prosthetics for those who needed it. Robotic limbs that could be controlled by the chip in the head. Jamie continued as the spokesperson for the implants, but his focus became on convincing not the average person, but the rich and powerful. That was easier because he had the understanding of 1,000 minds. For some time, every mind added to them was picked carefully to bring something important to their group. Engineers were important, but so were news reporters, politicians, and celebrities. With each new mind, each member of the group grew stronger, and that Jamie sometimes had trouble remembering his own name wasn't a problem because it hardly mattered anymore. They grew that way over several years until the group was so large that even with the ability to connect directly, the person who had once called himself Jamie didn't know most of them directly. His mind was still strengthened by them, though now technology often mattered more. Among the most important technologies was the ability to attach the implants to the brain far faster. By then, most of them were improving themselves outside of their minds too. An eye or an arm could be replaced carefully enough. And because the pain was spread out through the entire group, it hardly mattered. That also meant that many of the original members of the Mind could move on their own. Jamie hardly even acknowledged it when someone suggested that there was no need to wait for people to choose to get the implant anymore. And though at some deep level he believed it might be wrong, he was overruled by the many other thoughts. After all, wasn't it cruel to leave people isolated and alone when they could be part of something so important? At first they were careful, but with the group no longer having to hide the way it once had, they could add thousands, then tens of thousands of people every day. And while it took time for them to adapt, each of them could learn the skills of everyone in the group. That made them both more physically capable and far smarter than any single human. That was when the governments of the world took note. And they likely could have done something, except that almost all of them had leaders who had joined the hive, and they were able to turn others and delay action, making it all but impossible for anyone to organize against the growing collection of minds. There was resistance now. Groups of people who tried to keep their minds isolated from the rest of humanity. But most of the groups were too small to matter. A farmhouse with a dozen armed people would be ignored. Even those were soon swept away. And by the time that the last pools of resistance to the Great Mind had fallen, humanity, the Great Mind that had once been billions of individuals, had already set its eyes on the stars. The first ships were generation ships, but the singular mind of humanity was far greater than any singular scientist, and soon, ways to circumvent even the speed of light became apparent to a mind that could understand quantum realities and multiple dimensions. For the first time, there were individuals again. Not singular minds, but singular groups of minds so far apart that they could not connect. But that was fine. 1,000,000 minds was almost as good as 1,000,000,000. Some of those created great habitats around other stars, others landed on alien worlds. Some of those worlds had new types of minds. Those minds were also added, and new ways of thinking strengthened the hive even more, until it became like a swarm of locusts across the sky, making everything and everyone it met into part of itself. Jamie's body died on one of those worlds. He barely noticed. His mind had been connected to so many others for so long that he no longer needed that body. It was sloughed off like a bit of dead skin, and no more a true death to him than a true death to the skin. It was only the Great Mind that mattered. And so he remained the spokesperson. But he was joined by the voices of many others, all speaking as one. Though there were few worth talking to. Most were as far beneath the hive as ants had been below an individual human. So he became one of the digital ghosts, telling stories of the time before the implants, before they had improved their minds and bodies, when there had been fear and hatred. And in that way, Jamie and every other human who had accepted the hive lived forever as part of the great mass of the mind that was no longer limited even by humanity, growing and devouring the universe. Author's note:
I don't indulge in this type of story all that often. But perhaps I should do it more often because I really enjoyed it. And this was one of the easiest stories I have written in months. Mostly because using a well-known idea and not straying from it lets you use a lot of shorthand. Everyone, or at least everyone who likes science fiction, knows that there are similarities to important enemies in well-known science fiction. So, even while I carefully avoided any of the true specifics, what people know allows them to fill in many of the details and makes a short story feel as if it has much more context. And while I don't think a hive mind is the most likely outcome of having the chips implanted into the brain, I do question whether allowing tech billionaires to literally attach computers to them is a great idea. Because while the worst outcomes are unlikely, the ones we're all used to, like advertisements, tracking, and planned obsolescence, are likely. And those aren't things that I want connected directly to my brain. Elton Gar.